Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about one of the more interesting and convoluted eras of Red Army vehicle development, the search for a heavy tank before the Great Patriotic War. So, as I mentioned before, during the Russian Civil War, the Red Army captured a number of heavy tanks. These were Mark V tanks captured from the British. Now, these were rather archaic land ships that didn't really have a place in the Red Army's new armament system. And in fact, the Red Army didn't seem to want a heavy tank at all until 1929. There was absolutely no requirement for a heavy tank. In 1932, when the MS-1 tank was already replaced and the T-26 tank was put into service, as well as the T-27 tankette, the rest of the armament system that had been developed by then was not yet filled. The Red Army did not yet have a medium tank, which I will get to in a later video, and it did not have a heavy tank. It only had the requirements for a heavy tank. Now, these requirements required the tank to be used for breakthrough action, and this tank would fight enemy fortifications, enemy fortresses, and of course, enemy heavy tanks. Now, the armament of this tank had to be pretty impressive. It would have to have a 152mm main gun, as well as two 76mm secondary guns, and 12 to 14 machine guns, as well as two anti-aircraft autocannons. The armor of this tank would also have to be very impressive for its time. It would have to be able to withstand a hit from a 76mm gun or a 3-inch gun with a muzzle velocity of 800 meters per second at 50 meters. So basically, it would have to be proof against World War II era gun. All of these weapons had to fit in a fairly sizable package. The mass of the tank had to be at most 150 tons, which was still quite heavier than any tank built to date, including French super heavy tanks. Now, the USSR knew that it was impossible to develop such an advanced tank with its existing resources. So, in addition to looking at foreign inspiration, foreign specialists were invited into the USSR. Now, one of these specialists was the famous Edward Grote, who worked not only on a medium tank, but also on a heavy tank. Now, this tank was a land ship. It would have 3 or 6 turrets. It would be armed with two 304mm guns, four 152 and 76mm guns, and two 45mm guns. Its armor would be up to 300mm thick. It would have several engines with a combined output of 24,000 horsepower. Of course, such a tank was completely impossible to build. In March of 1932, Grote proposed a slightly more reasonable tank. It weighed between 70 and 75 tons. It had up to 70 millimeters of armor, and it was armed with one 76mm gun and two 45mm. This design evolved into the 100-ton T-42 tank, which was armed with main turrets that had a 107mm gun, a smaller turret that had a 76mm gun, and a third turret that had a 45mm gun. Now, Germany wasn't the only country helping the USSR to make tanks. In 1932, the Italian Ansaldo company was asked to design a super heavy tank for the USSR. The result of this was a tank weighing up to 70 tons that was slightly more reasonable than Grote's tank, but still was not produced. Work on all of these tanks was combined to make the tank called T-39. There were very many variants of it. It had either 2 or 4 turrets, guns as big as 152 millimeters, and it would have a crew of 12. It was powered by the M34 engine, which was supposed to develop up to 970 horsepower, or a Hispano-Suiza engine that delivered over 1,000 horsepower. Only wooden models of these tanks were built until the T-35 was accepted into service, and all further work on these super heavy tanks was cancelled. Work on the T-35 tank began in 1931. The goal was to make a breakthrough tank that weighed up to 35 tons. A prototype of the tank was built on August 20th, 1935. This prototype was called T-35-1. It had one turret that had a 76mm PS1 gun, and it had two small turrets that had 37mm PS2 guns, and two more turrets that had TT machine guns only. This tank looked pretty impressive, but the commission it was shown to rejected it and gave several pointers to make the tank fit for service. Improvements to the design were finished by April of 1933, and on August 11, 1933, this tank was accepted into service as the T-35A, most commonly just called T-35. And the first production tank was built on November 1st, 1933. Now, the production tank was slightly different than the prototype. It had a KT gun, the same gun used in the T-28, instead of the PS-1 gun, and the smaller turrets had 45mm guns as opposed to 37mm guns. In addition to the main gun, many components were shared with other tanks, including the entire main turret, which was exactly the same as the one used on the T-28 tank. The smaller turrets were similar to those used on other tanks, but not quite the same. The suspension was entirely original, and so were most other aspects of the tank. The tank used the same 500 horsepower M17 gasoline engine as used on the BT-7 tank. However, the production version reached 42.5 tons in weight, and of course the tank was significantly slower. Now, the weight of the tank had increased up to 55 tons by the end of its production, and the M17 engine was supercharged to 580 horsepower, which made it a little bit more nimble, but of course, as a heavy tank, it was still quite slow. A significant problem with this tank was that it was only equipped with up to 20 millimeters of armor. When the tank was first envisioned, this was enough, since the biggest gun it would face in the battlefield was a British 3-pounder gun, which did not have very high penetration. However, experience in the Spanish Civil War showed that high-caliber machine guns and small 37mm class anti-tank cannons were already common, and the T-35 just did not have protection from that kind of weapon. Attempts were made to increase its armor to 70mm, but the tank was so overloaded that this would not have been possible. In 1938, several tanks were made with sloped turret and turret platform sides like the T-26 and BT-7, but this just simply did not make the tank viable in the battlefield. In 1938, an appraisal of the Red Army's current armored vehicles stated that the T-28 and T-35 tanks do not meet requirements for fortification breakthrough tanks, especially in combat against anti-tank guns. This kicked off the development of new heavy tanks for the Red Army, which concluded with the KV-1 heavy tank. Only 59 production tanks and 2 prototypes were built between 1931 and 1940. When the Great Patriotic War started, the tank crews had no experience in using these tanks in actual combat, and so it turned out that they were quite unreliable and difficult to drive. As a result, most of these tanks were lost due to mechanical failure or crashing into things or being stuck instead of actually in combat. Only 5 tanks survived the summer of 1941, most of which were in terrible condition, and only 1 tank, which was used by a tank school, had been repaired and is later seen in some wartime footage. This tank survives until today and was until recently on display at the Kubenka Tank Museum. If you're interested in learning about the T-35's combat career, there is no better source in English than Francis Pulham's Fallen Giants. This book features a detailed record of combat involving T-35 tanks, including many detailed photos from various angles and identifications of all known T-35 tanks to date. Now, let's take a closer look at what the T-35 looks like and how similar it is to other tanks. Now, there's a reason why I compared the Mark V and the T-35. Both had very large crews of about a dozen men, but as you can see here, the T-35 was quite significantly larger. I can't really see it well in the video, but it was almost exactly as wide but significantly longer. This change in the width to length ratio made it quite difficult to drive, and as a result, only the best drivers could be used to drive this tank. The fighting compartment was a bit roomier. As you can see, the engine is actually inside of the fighting compartment of the Mark V tank. In the T-35, the engine is back here, and you have this quite large fighting compartment that encompasses all of the 5 turrets. Alright, here is the T-35 in all its glory. As you can see, there are 2 gun turrets with 45mm guns, one here and one here, and a large turret with a 76mm gun. Now, this is a low-velocity 76mm gun, which mostly fired high-explosive ammunition. The tank relied on these 45mm guns in the smaller turrets to fight enemy tanks. There are also 2 machine gun turrets, one here and one here, which have 76.2mm DT machine guns. There was also one of these machine guns in every turret in this tank, as well as a machine gun in an anti-aircraft gun mount on the commander's cupola here, which is missing on this model. From the front of the tank, you can see the driver's station here. Unlike many heavy tanks later and even medium tanks, there is no assistant driver. The driver of this tank is all on his own. His position is flanked by the 45mm gun turret and the machine gun turret behind him. These two things here are the headlights. The headlights can pivot down and they're enclosed in an armored casing to protect them in combat. This design was very interesting. It was actually phased out of Soviet tanks after the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, but the Finns quite liked them, and so if you see a captured Finnish tank, it will actually have these headlights installed on it, even if it didn't have them originally. For example, the Finnish captured T-34 tank that is currently on display at the Bovington Tank Museum has headlights like these. Moving on to the main turret here, you can see the 76mm gun that I was talking about. It's quite a short, stubby gun. And you can see the machine gun in the turret. Now, the machine gun is installed in a separate ball mount instead of being coaxial with the main gun. This was the way that most Soviet machine guns were installed until the coaxial mount was copied from the Germans after their tanks were studied at the tank school in Kazan. The big horseshoe shape around the turret here is a radio antenna, and you can see where it connects to the radio that's held inside the turret. Now, all T-35 tanks had radios. This was not an optional feature like you see on wartime T-34s. Here's a closer look at the 45mm gun turret, and I have the BT-7 tank next to it to compare. As you can see, the turrets are quite similar, but still not identical. So there's the two rectangular hatches here for the gunner and the loader. You have the gunner's periscopic sight. You have here in the center a cover for a ventilation fan. And over here is a socket for an optional second periscope. Both of these tanks have 45mm guns here with coaxial 7.62mm machine guns. And they are in a very similar gun mount as well. But the major difference here is that the T-26 turret, or the BT-7 turret, BT-5, the BA-6 armored car had all these turrets as well. It has this bustle on the back here, which houses the radio and the ammunition. Now, since the T-35 had so much more room for storage and the radio was in the turret, there was no need for an additional turret bustle. And in fact, you couldn't fit an additional turret bustle because the turret platform for the main turret was right behind it. From the back here, you can see the second 45mm gun turret, as well as the second DT machine gun turret, which you didn't see earlier. So you can see they're quite different in size. So this turret actually only contains one person, so you only really needed one person to service the machine gun. From this side, you can also see the rear machine gun of the primary turret. The idea was that this machine gun could be taken out of this socket and used in the P-40 anti-aircraft gun mount when necessary. Here is the engine and transmission compartment of the tank. As you noticed from before, it is quite massive. It actually takes up about half of the length of the tank. And this layout with a V-shaped engine in the middle here, you can see that these parts are raised because that's where the cooling grills are for the engine, and a transmission in the back. This layout was used by many Soviet tanks even after the start of the Great Patriotic War. And here is probably one of the most interesting parts of the tank, the suspension. As you can see here, this is a coil spring suspension, so there's two pairs of springs in each suspension bogie, and there are 4 bogies per side in total. As you could see from the other side, the suspension was covered up by a 10mm thick plate. Unfortunately, as with most tanks with the suspension design, the plate made maintenance very difficult, and if mud was stuck behind it, it would actually make the tank throw a track or steer very poorly or just generally exhibit various mechanical failures that you don't want. Over here you see the big rear sprocket. Ignore the missing track section here. This is what would power the tank. It looks quite similar to the sprocket used in the future developments such as the KV tank. One of the major changes involved in the T-35 production had to do with the sprocket. It turned out that mud would actually build up behind the plates that protected the suspension, and the track would slip off the sprocket. So later tanks would actually have a cutaway made here in order to make the sprocket. It didn't protect the sprocket, but it made it easier to clean and it improved the reliability. And here is the T-35 next to its successor, the KV-1. All of the extra gun turrets had been disposed of. The main turret still houses 3 people, and it still has a 76mm gun, but the 76mm L11 was much more powerful than the short-barreled KT. The suspension is a torsion bar suspension that is much simpler, much more reliable. It doesn't need side armor to protect it, and the tank is significantly shorter. The weight of this KV tank is actually around 40 tons, so despite being much smaller and much lighter than the T-35, it has superior protection up to 75mm all around, so that makes it a much better tank that was much more useful in the battlefield. And naturally, many more of these tanks of this type were built, and they had a much greater impact on combat. You can actually see in the back here, the layout is the same with the V2 engine in the middle and the cooling grills on the side here. Now, was the T-35 a waste of time and resources? If you look at its combat record and its production record, where only 59 tanks were built and they had hardly any effect on the course of the Great Patriotic War, one might be inclined to say yes. However, the production of the T-35 tank in the interbellum years gave the Soviet Union what it needed most: experience. Even though the T-35 tanks themselves weren't all that useful, Soviet factories got to know what it took to build a heavy tank. Soviet designers figured out how to design and improve a very expensive and large and complicated vehicle over time. And even though the T-35 itself wasn't all that great, as you could see, the KV-1, its successor, uses many of the same layout solutions that were implemented in the T-35. Compared to its monstrous contemporaries such as the T-39 and the T-42, production of the T-35 tank was definitely the best choice for the Soviet Union.